Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining Homestead National Historical Park for a very special program in celebration of Black History Month. Over the past few years, we've been researching and learning more about the African American homesteading experience across the country, including in Oklahoma, where it's estimated that the majority of African American homesteaders settled. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Faye Yarbrough, Associate Professor of History at Rice University. Dr. Yarbrough studies American Indian and African American history, especially the interaction between those two groups. Her first book, Race and the Cherokee Nation, Sovereignty in the 19th Century, explores the formation of tribal and racial identities. Her current project is on the participation of Choctaw Indians in the Civil War. Today she'll be sharing a program titled Uncertain Freedom, Choctaw Freedpeople in Indian Territory in the Aftermath of the Civil War, which will explore the history of African Americans held in bondage by Choctaw Indians. We'll have time for questions at the end of the program, so please feel free to post some in the live chat. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yarbrough.
Thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on a Sunday afternoon and for accommodating a change in schedule as Texas dealt with what I'm referring to as Snowmageddon last week. So I want to, before I begin my talk today, just warn you ahead of time that I will be talking about violence and slavery, and so sometimes the subject matter can be tough to hear. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a warning before we get started. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I have some maps and images that I want to show you. Please bear with me because I am not the most tech-savvy person that you'll encounter. So let's see, let me start the slideshow. Here we go. All right. So, the institution of racialized slavery looms large in the history of the United States and evokes in particular images of cotton fields ruled by white enslavers and overseers who administered the lash to the laboring backs of enslaved people. Of course, historians continually add more nuance to this image by exploring other experiences of enslaved people, such as those in urban settings, those that did not live on large plantations, or those who cultivated rice. Today, I want to contribute to the expansion of our thinking about slavery by focusing on the experience of enslaved people among the Choctaw Indians and in Indian Territory more broadly. So this afternoon, I will approach a familiar topic, the Civil War, in some ways from a less familiar vantage point, by focusing explicitly on the Choctaw Nation. And I think it bears reminding that the Civil War was not just a rupture between northern and southern states or just between Americans over the issue of slavery. Other groups were drawn into this dispute. Several American Indian nations, including the Choctaw Nation, officially sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. And here, I just as a little bit of a pause and an explanation and a shout out to Mildred Brown. I want to say something about my focus on the Choctaw Nation since my first book was about the Cherokee Nation. While I was working on that project, I was in the archives in Oklahoma City, and I met a volunteer archivist, Mrs. Mildred Brown. And she asked me what I was doing. You're here every day. What are you working on? And I told her that I was interested in these interactions between Native people and people of African descent in the Cherokee Nation. And she immediately said, you should study my family. And you would be surprised at how many people in the archives will tell you that you should study their family. And I said, okay, well, you know, what's happening in your family? What makes them so interesting? And Mrs. Brown is a descendant of William Beams, and she's a member of the Choctaw Nation. And her family story, the story of her ancestors, which Daniel Littlefield has written about in an article, reads like a Lifetime movie. Beams was a white man who lived in the Choctaw Nation and first married a Choctaw woman and had children. He then later has children with an enslaved woman, and the whole long story ends with the Euro-Choctaw children attempting to have their half-siblings of Choctaw and African and white descent enslaved. So while I was studying and looking for more information about the Beams family, because Mrs. Brown was absolutely right, someone should write more about them, I found Choctaw legislative documents from the era that revealed that Choctaw lawmakers spent a great deal of time talking about their commitment to the Confederate States of America. Choctaw legal authorities even proposed a measure demanding that all whites living in the Choctaw Nation swear allegiance to the Confederate cause. They then deemed any criticism of the Confederacy or of the Confederate Army to be a form of treason against the Choctaw Nation and punishable by death. Lawmakers raised an infantry force, then later a cavalry, to fight with the Confederate forces. What accounted for this level of commitment to the Confederate cause among the Choctaws? What aspects of Confederate ideology appealed to Choctaw authorities? My larger project, which John mentioned, Choctaw Confederates, the American Civil War in Indian Country, from which today's talk comes, attempts to answer those questions. And the book is forthcoming with the University of North Carolina Press this fall. A little plug for that project. So Choctaw Indians and other Native groups were obviously deeply concerned about issues of states' rights and sovereignty, but they also had a vested interest in the maintenance of the institution of slavery, all of which were paramount to the Confederate South as well. European traders and settlers introduced the Choctaws to enslaved African people as early as the 1720s. And if we see here this map of the 1820 Eastern Indian nations in the Southeast, you can see the nations of the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, and way down in that corner, Seminole nations in the southeastern United States, right? So this map is of 1820. By 1830, 1831, a federal census conducted in preparation for removing Choctaw Indians to Indian Territory enumerated nearly 18,000 Indians, 151 white persons, and 521 enslaved people. Here, just 8 years later, I'm showing you a map of Indian Territory from 1830 to 1855, which is in the present-day state of Oklahoma, and you can see the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations combined in the southern third of the territory. So just 8 years later, in 1839, there were approximately 600 enslaved people of African descent living among the Choctaws, and I will show you this map on that gives you a sense of what Indian Territory looked like as the Civil War commenced, right? So you can see, again, Indian Territory in that shape of the state of Oklahoma and the Choctaw Nation in the bottom southeast corner of the territory. So at this point, on the eve of the Civil War, the enslaved Black population comprised 14% of the population in the Choctaw Nation, nearly 2,400 people out of almost 17,000. So enslaved people in the nation performed agricultural labor, and when fluent in both English and Choctaw languages, frequently served as interpreters for their Choctaw enslavers. Like their counterparts in the American South, Choctaw enslavers carefully circumscribed the behavior of their chattel by passing legislation that prevented enslaved people from owning property or carrying guns without permission from their owners, and that prohibited the education of enslaved people. The Confederate States' argument for secession then addressed two concerns for the Choctaws: protecting their right to own human property and buttressing their claims to sovereignty. Surely, the newly formed Confederate government could not profess to respect the sovereignty of each member state while denying the sovereignty of Indian nations, right? This is surely the logic that these Native nations were thinking. And the Constitution of the newly formed Confederate States of America included clear and inviolable protections for the institution of slavery. So when the war ended, the Choctaw Nation found itself subject to federal authority like their Southern Confederate brethren. And as with the American South, the federal government attempted to reestablish friendly relations with the Choctaw Nation and to create a new position within Choctaw society for freed people formerly held as slaves by members of the Choctaw Nation. Federal authorities negotiated a treaty with the Choctaw Nation that included provisions for granting the Choctaw freed people Choctaw citizenship, civil rights, and access to land, something that the federal government neglected to do for its own formerly enslaved population, but the Choctaw Nation circumvented these measures. In a move that bears some striking similarities to events in the post-Civil War American South, Choctaw lawmakers created another class of citizenship for people of African descent within the Choctaw Nation. Ironically, given the history of removal, 19th century Choctaws were far more Southern than their contemporaries realized. So I'd like to spend the rest of my time today discussing the end of this Choctaw story, right? So if we look at this map, that's in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, right? We can see Indian Territory and the various Native nations that comprised Indian Territory at this time, 1866 to 1889. So I want to focus on this end part of the story, how enslaved people in the Choctaw Nation conceived of freedom. And I would like to discuss some of the limits placed on that freedom by Choctaw authorities. I'm going to be examining the interviews. I'll rely heavily on the interviews of formerly enslaved people more broadly through the WPA slave narratives, and show that, I hope, they demonstrate moments of tangency between formerly enslaved people in the southern states and freed people in the Indian Territory. That these moments of tangency include receiving news of emancipation in similar ways, for instance, but then real moments of difference with respect to access of land. Then I'll turn my attention briefly to Choctaw legislative activity to restrict the rights of the newly freed people living in the Choctaw Nation. And just a note about the WPA slave narratives, if you are not familiar with them. So these are the Works Progress Administration's supported narratives, collected the accounts of formerly enslaved people. But where they actually originate, the genesis for the idea is actually in historically Black colleges and universities, where scholars there went out and interviewed formerly enslaved people in their communities in the 1820s, sorry, I'm such a 19th century historian, in the 1920s and 1930s, because they realized that these people were dying and all these memories about the experience of slavery were dying with them. And so they initially started interviewing people. Well, as the Great Depression hit, the federal government is trying to put people to work, including authors and artists. And they will also see this activity that's happening in HBCUs and say, oh, we should pay people to go out and interview these formerly enslaved people as well. And the narratives are now in over 50 volumes. They're divided by state. The narratives, the state that the account is included in is determined by where they were when they were interviewed, which is not necessarily where people were when they were actually enslaved. So there can be a little bit of a difference there. There are a lot of concerns that people have about these narratives in terms of potential biases, right? Because the interviews happen so long after the actual experience of slavery, or their overrepresentation of particular states, et cetera. But they're very valuable, and I think used carefully, we can certainly extract a lot of truth from them. And they're one of the few remaining sources that we have to access the lives of enslaved people. So I think they're really important and valuable sources. Now, there's a similar initiative that's the Indian Pioneer History Collection, and those are interviews with, of people who were resident in Indian Territory in the 19th century. And so those are available through the Oklahoma Historical Society. You can access them online, the Indian Pioneer Histories. And the WPA slave narratives are at university libraries, but you can also access them through the Library of Congress. The other thing that's really cool about them is that sometimes the interviewer takes a picture of the formerly enslaved person. And so those images are also included, and I'll show you some of those today. So that's just a note on the sources that I'm going to be leaning on today. So freedom came to those enslaved people of African descent owned by the Choctaws and enslaved people in Indian Territory more generally in ways that match the experiences of enslaved people in the southern states. For instance, owners were not always forthcoming about the news of emancipation. Molly Barber's mother was enslaved in the Creek Nation and did not learn about freedom until afterwards during a serendipitous conversation with a passerby. She had been cooking dinner for her mistress, but upon learning of her freedom, she run back in the house, grab up what little clothes she had, made a bundle, and leave that place with the dinner almost ready. Bless her old black heart, she was glad to be free. Red Richardson of Texas claimed that his father's enslaver did not free him until the second threat from President Lincoln. Perhaps Richardson was referring to the passage of the 13th Amendment, or the late dissemination of the news about the Emancipation Proclamation in the state of Texas. Joanna Draper was enslaved in Mississippi, and her owner bound her out to the Deason family during the war. She had been with the family for 4 years before deciding to run away because of her bad treatment. After her escape, she discovered she was free. I never will forgive that white man for not telling me I was free and not helping me get back to my mammy and pappy. Lots of white people done that. Decades later, one can still feel Draper's deep resentment about the Deasons' dishonesty. One can only guess at how long the Deasons would have continued to exploit Draper's labor and permit her to call them master without cause. Perhaps Draper's experience was similar to Robert Williams, who had been enslaved in Mississippi. He recalled matter-of-factly, even after freedom, he, referring to Williams' enslaver, owned a dark year too. I was one. On the other hand, many enslavers did inform the enslaved population of emancipation and held true to their obligation to release these people from bondage. Mary Lindsay's Chickasaw mistress informed Lindsay and another household enslaved person of their freedom. She say, "You and Vicky just as free as I am." She then offered the women room, board, and several dresses if the freed women continued to work for her. Formerly enslaved people, both from Indian Territory and from southern states, repeated similar stories of enslavers using this kind of phrasing, "as free as I am." For instance, Phyllis Petite, Sina Banks, L.B. Barner, and Doc Daniel Dowdy each recalled enslavers using similar language when the enslavers gathered people together to inform them of emancipation. Unlike the story of the Deason family and Joanna Draper, Sina Banks' young enslaver told her, "It is my duty to take you back to your mother, but if you will stay with me and help me till I get my crop in, I will take you home." Banks agreed to stay. Sarah Wilson's Cherokee enslaver told his enslaved population of emancipation only reluctantly. After refugeeing enslaved people to Texas across the border from the Choctaw Nation, which you can see in the map, he received word of emancipation from Fort Smith. Unable to read, he asked his daughter to read the letter. He went wild and jumped on her and beat the devil out of her, said she was lying to him. It near about killed him to let us loose, but he cooled down after a while and said he would help us all get back home if we wanted to come. Wilson described her former enslaver as a hellion. However, despite his resentment for this change in status for his human property, he still honored it. Still other formerly enslaved people learned about freedom from the arrival of Yankee soldiers. Charlotte Johnson White, who you can see here seated. Again, this is an example of a photo taken during the interview process. Charlotte Johnson White had been owned in the Cherokee Nation and remembered nearly 100 soldiers arriving at the house. They was a pretty sight, setting on their horses, and the men had on blue uniforms with little caps. "All the slaves is free," one of them said. George Kai left Arkansas to serve in the Army in his enslaver Abe Stover's stead. He was Abe Stover's substitute, and drove a team of mules for the Secesh soldiers from Van Buren to Texarkana and back for 2 years. After some fighting, a federal soldier approached Kai and asked who owned the mules, to which Kai replied, "Abe Stover." The soldier then said, "Let me tell you, black boy, you are as free now as old Abe Stover his own self." Eliza Evans, formerly enslaved in Alabama, did not learn of her freedom from Union troops. Rather, a soldier taught her to be sassy. At the direction of a Union soldier, when called an epithet by her owner, Evans replied, real pert-like, "I's a Negro, and I'm Miss Liza Mixon." Right? This is a big deal that she took that honorific title of Miss, right? And for this impertinence, Evans received a whipping from her grandmother. Some formerly enslaved people were quite specific about the date of their freedom. Sally Henderson Moss remembered the Choctaw freedmen celebrating emancipation on August the 4th, the date that the Choctaws freed their human property, according to Moss. Similarly, Choctaw freedman R.C. Smith also linked emancipation to August the 4th, 1866. Interestingly, Smith did not invoke February of 1863. Remember, he was owned by Cherokees, which is the date that the Cherokee General Council abolished slavery in the Cherokee Nation. He didn't refer to that date as his moment of emancipation. And this likely reflects the division within the Cherokee Nation. The nation officially sided with the Confederacy by 1861, but many nation members then actually fought with the Union Army. And then Confederate Cherokees did not recognize any legislation passed by Union sympathizers in the Cherokee government, and that's who passed abolition. So Moss and Smith might have been referencing the August date rather than the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation or the ratification of the 13th Amendment, because the summer of 1866 coincided with the ratification of the Treaty of 1866 for the various Native groups in Indian Territory that had sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. The stipulations of the treaties included the abolition of slavery among Confederate Indians. Ida Henry, formerly enslaved in Texas, recalled the familiar June 19th, the date for her emancipation. Katie Rowe, who I have another image here, right, from 1937, seated in a rocking chair. Katie Rowe had also been enslaved in Texas, and she described her own emancipation with remarkable clarity and detail. Being interrupted at work, gathering in the overseer's yard, and receiving the news from a stranger. She concluded, "It was the 4th day of June in 1865 I begins to live. And I'm going to take the picture of that old man in the big black hat and long whiskers sitting on the gallery and talking kind to us, clean into my grave with me." Formerly enslaved people differed in their descriptions of what emancipation meant to them individually, and this variation was similar both among the formerly enslaved population in Indian Territory and those from nearby southern states. Some formerly enslaved people, such as Paul Garnett, Roebuck's father, who had been enslaved among the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians, told their children that emancipation did not mean a change in their treatment. They had been treated well under slavery and continued to receive fair treatment from their owners' families after the Civil War. Matilda Poe experienced better material conditions while enslaved in the Chickasaw Nation than as a freed woman. "I never did know I was a slave because I couldn't tell I wasn't free. I always had a good time, didn't have to work much, and always had something to eat and wear. And that was better than it is with me now." Eliza Evans went so far as to assert that John Mixon's slaves did not want to be freed and they hated Yankee soldiers. William Walters, who had been enslaved in Tennessee, did not have much patience for such talk. "Those were awful times. Yet I have heard many of the older Negroes say that the old days were better. Such talk always seemed to be but an expression of sentiment for some good old master, or else the older Negroes were just too handicapped with ignorance to recognize the benefits of liberty or the opportunities of freedom." The other thing that I think we should bear in mind that scholars have written about is that these interviews are taken during the Great Depression. And so they're also an indicator of the really extreme material deprivation that these formerly enslaved people were experiencing in that moment, right? So there are also other descriptions in these narratives where they're talking about food, and you can't help but wonder if they're talking about the food they ate under enslavement in such careful detail, because there are people who are literally starving to death. So Keziah Love described her Choctaw owner, Frank Colbert, as fairly kind, yet she reveled in news of her freedom nonetheless. "I was glad to be free. What did I do and say? Well, I just clapped my hands together and said, 'Thank God Almighty, I's free at last.'" I'm sure you're hearing echoes of the later Martin Luther King Jr. speech. Lizzie Jackson, formerly enslaved in Creek Nation, offered a succinct assessment. "I'm glad that slave days is gone. Even if the master was good, the slaves was bad off." And unfortunately, many masters were not kind. Annie Hawkins, formerly enslaved in Texas, recalled, "We was the happiest folks in the world when we knowed we was free. We couldn't realize it at first, but how we did shout and cry for joy when we did realize it. Hawkins and fellow enslaved people feared their fetid, mean masters so much that initially they were afraid to leave the plantation because they feared their mistress would bring them back. Similarly, Lou Smith, formerly enslaved in Texas, described her mistress, Miss Jo, as lowbrow, with little experience in how to treat enslaved people. Accordingly, Miss Jo treated her human property like dogs, even denying them food, according to Smith's account. Upon hearing news of her emancipation, 11-year-old Lou Smith hid in the plum orchard and repeated to herself, I's free, I ain't never going back to Miss Jo. Katie Rowe, the same person I referred to earlier, who you can see here on the screen, understood emancipation as the end of brutal punishment. No, bless God, I ain't never seen no more black boys bleeding all up and down the back under a cat o' nine tails. And I never go by no cabin and hear no poor groaning, all wrapped up in a lardy sheet, no more. In fact, Rowe was sure that she herself would have died had she remained under the authority of her cruel former overseer, Mr. Saunders. For other formerly enslaved people, emancipation meant the possibility of reuniting families separated by sale or war. Esme Wofford's second enslaver moved her from Mississippi to Texas, apparently leaving behind Wofford's husband. Once the war was over, her husband came to Texas to find her, and they then farmed near the town of Midway. The Perrymans owned Mary Grayson's family in the Creek Nation, and when some of the men in the Grayson's family ran away to join the Union Army, their enslavers tried to move their human property to prevent further runaways. The family returned to the Creek Agency at the war's end, where Grayson's mother met a Negro who had seen Pappy and knew where he was. So we sent word to him, and he came and found us. Sale separated Johnson Thompson's grandmother and father, so separated a mother from an adult son. And the grandmother remained in Indian Territory while the rest of the family lived in Texas with their new master, John Harnage. Thompson recalled that when the war ended, Pappy wanted to get back to his mother and made a deal to drive for a white man who was moving into Indian Territory. William Curtis's enslaved parents married in Georgia, but were also separated through sale. It nigh broke our hearts when he, Curtis's father, had to leave, and old Master Shore done everything he could to make it up to us. After the war, however, Curtis's father returned to the family. Curtis stated plainly, that was the best thing about the war setting us free. He could come back to us. Clearly, other formerly enslaved people agreed with Curtis and sometimes went to great lengths, really extraordinary lengths, to reconnect with parents, spouses, children, and siblings. Reunions were made possible by freed people's newfound freedom of movement by this mobility, but other formerly enslaved people remained on plantations where they had long labored. For instance, Anthony Dawson, who we see here seated. I like Mr. Dawson's mustache. Anthony Dawson and Eliza Bell each described their families or fellow enslaved people remaining with their owners. Similarly, Ebenezer Kutnezer Kemp's father continued to farm for his former owner, Jackson Kemp, long after emancipation. Mary Ellen Phillips Wynn's mother married into the Choctaw Nation when Wynn was a girl, and her Choctaw stepfather claimed that his family's enslaved people remained with the family after emancipation and continued to work the land. Some freedmen worked for shares and others for pay or food and shelter. Former enslaved person Ed Butler thought some enslaved people favored freedom, but others feared starvation and did not know how to care for themselves. Perhaps this anxiety led some enslaved people to remain on plantations. Similarly, Eliza Elsie, formerly enslaved in Texas, described enslaved people who stayed on the plantation because they didn't know how to sell cattle or hogs or sugarcane, and the master sell part of the crops and give the Negroes some of the money, right? So if you're unsure about your ability to navigate the economic landscape, then you might stay with your former owner because they're willing to conduct business negotiations for you. William Curtis's newly reunited family initially chose to stay with their old enslaver. Yes, we was free, but we didn't know what to do. We didn't want to leave our old master and our old home. The transformation from property to person occurred fairly quickly, and it was likely comforting for some to remain in communities with families and within established relationships in which both parties, the formerly enslaved and the former masters, knew what to expect from each other. In treaty discussions in 1866, the federal government, as it did with the South, required the Choctaw Nation to accept its newly emancipated people as citizens with political and civil rights in the nation. The Choctaw Nation balked at this condition and requested that the federal government remove the freedmen from their territory. The federal government did not comply, and for almost 20 years, the freedmen in the Choctaw Nation existed in a kind of legal limbo until the passage of the Freedmen Bill in 1883. During this time, Choctaw authorities treated the freedmen as American citizens, and as such, the freedmen generally fell under the legal jurisdiction of federal courts. Likewise, the Choctaw Nation did not provide any schools for the children of freedmen, which induced federal authorities to do so. On the other hand, by common assent, Choctaws permitted the freedmen to cultivate as much land as they desired in the nation, though they had no rights to the public domain. And what this means is that if the Choctaw government, for instance, negotiated a land sale with the federal government, the freed people would have no right to the proceeds, to any of the funds that resulted from that, because they have no rights in the public domain. The time lag between the 1866 treaty and the formal adoption of the freedmen into the Choctaw Nation was due in part to the reluctance of the Choctaws to accept their former chattel as citizens. The Freedmen Bill of 1883 finally clarified the status of the roughly 3,500 Choctaw freed people and enumerated their rights in the nation. The freedmen gained citizenship rights, including the suffrage, the right to equal process in civil and criminal matters in the Choctaw courts, 40 acres of land to be held in the manor of other Choctaws, equal educational opportunities, and the right to hold political offices other than principal or district chief in the nation. The freedmen were not legally entitled, however, to any annuity monies or, again, to access to the public domain, which confirmed previous practice. Just as an interesting pattern, the Cherokee Nation would also pass an act limiting Cherokee freedmen's access to the public domain in 1886, just 3 years after this Freedmen Bill in the Choctaw Nation. But they had already accepted their freed people as citizens. And you might be thinking about this 40 acres, which resonates with the idea of 40 acres as and a mule, that comes with Special Field Order 15 and William Sherman, but I'm not sure where that specific 40-acre amount comes from. But I will point out that the Homestead Act gave folks 160 acres. So this is a much smaller portion if we're thinking about larger federal policy. So they're not getting access to the public domain. They're not getting access to annuity monies, the Choctaw free people. They also can't confer Choctaw citizenship on others through marriage, which other Choctaw citizens could. And freedmen who chose to leave the nation were entitled to $100. Before the year was over, the General Council would vote to revoke the freedmen's rights to hold any political office, not just those high offices of principal or district chief. So while the Choctaw freedmen lacked the full legal and political rights of Choctaw citizens by blood, their access to land was a concrete and significant benefit of citizenship, one that the formerly enslaved people in southern states lacked and desperately wanted. Choctaw freedwoman Frances Banks, who you can see here. I'm sorry it's such a dark image, but here she is, we think circa 1910, seated. Choctaw freedwoman Frances Banks remarked, "After the war, I was what you call a freedman. The Indians had to give all their slaves 40 acres of land. I've always lived on this land, which joins that of Old Master, and I've never stayed away from it long at a time." Sally Henderson Moss recalled that her stepfather, Robert Wright, had a right to land in the Choctaw Nation as a freedman. Squire Hall and his wife both received freedmen allotments, which he described as partly in the rich land of the Arkansas River bottom and the remainder on the high ground which skirts the valley land. Robert Lewis stated, I had a lot of relatives there who owned quite a bit of land that they had been allotted. They were freedmen. The land that these freedmen owned had consequences for their children as well. The children could inherit this property or this right to land. Lula Neighbors lived on land she accessed through her mother, a Choctaw freedwoman. This 40 acres where I live now was given to me after statehood. It is my claim. I have a right from mothers being a freedwoman. Similarly, excuse me, Thomas Franklin described his mother as slave Choctaw and stated, when I was born in 1873, I became a member of the tribe, and years later I received an allotment of 40 acres in Garvin County. Alas, the colored population did not always manage to maintain title to this land. Matthew Maytubby was born in 1889, not long after the passage of the Freedmen Bill, and noted with some chagrin, we all had land given to us by the government, but fiddled it away drinking and gambling. My pappy didn't drink, and I wish I didn't. This inability to retain possession of these allotments was part of a larger pattern of land loss because of federal policy. Tribal groups controlled 138 million acres of land in the 19th century prior to allotment and only 55 million acres by 1934. Around actually the same time many of these Indian Pioneer History and Works Progress Administration interviews were recorded. For some African Americans from southern states, the ability for the freedmen to access land suggested that there was more opportunity for people of color in general in Indian Territory. Even non-freedmen observers knew that people enslaved by Indians had a right to land. Lula Neighbor's father was a state man, that is somebody who, a person of African descent who was from a nearby state, who moved to Choctaw Nation from Georgia. When he saw the Civil War was over, he decided to come west, where colored people were given a better chance to make a living. He came to the Choctaw Nation and married my mother, a freedwoman, Neighbors reports. This marriage enabled Neighbor's father to access land ownership more readily than would have been possible in Georgia. In a similar vein, when white Americans had long recognized the possibility of improving one's economic standing by marrying Native women to gain access to land. There are actually letters from white soldiers who say, if you want to be successful, the first thing you've got to do is go find you an Indian wife, and then you can have access to land. Lucy Cherry's mother moved to Indian Territory from Alabama after emancipation and married William Crush, a Choctaw Indian. One cannot help but wonder if the attraction of this move for Cherry's mother, just as it was for Neighbor's father, was the perception that conditions for freed people might be better in Indian Territory. Alice Alexander had been enslaved in Louisiana and walked to Oklahoma with her husband and other freedmen in search of education. We came to Oklahoma looking for the same things then that darkies go north looking for now, but we got disappointed, she said. Alexander and her fellow freedmen were likely unaware of the resistance Native groups displayed toward incorporating formerly enslaved people into society and their unwillingness to provide schools for the colored population. I have to point out that some of these allotments would later become the basis for all Black towns that sprung up in the state of Oklahoma. So again, the access to land that these freed people had in Indian Territory has huge repercussions for their families, but also for Black communities. If there are some towns that the starting plots are these allotments received by freed people. So the concessions of the Freedmen Bill were an obvious improvement in the condition of formerly enslaved people in the Choctaw Nation, and more, particularly with respect to land, than the freedmen of the American South were able to achieve. However, they also exposed the resistance of the Choctaw Nation to incorporate formerly enslaved people into their country. Choctaw authorities simultaneously declared the freedmen possessed all the rights, privileges, and immunities of Choctaw citizens, but then carefully circumscribed those rights. Thus, the freedmen had access to land, but not to the public domain or annuity funds that resulted in the sale of Choctaw land. The freedmen could vote, but not hold particular political offices. So while emancipation led to citizenship for freed people in both the Choctaw Nation and in the American South, in Indian Territory, this citizenship came with land, something for which most formerly enslaved people in the United States could only wish. However, this land did not come with equality. Thank you. I'll unshare my screen and I'm happy to answer questions that folks might have. Okay, let's see. Unshare.
All right, so we've got several questions here. The first one, you mentioned the WPA slave narratives as a source. Where did you say I can find those, and are they available for all states?
They are not available for all states, I don't think. Well, clearly not for northern states. So you can find them in a number of ways. If you have access to a university library, they are there where you can see the physical copies. But you can also go to the Library of Congress's website and you can see those narratives there digitized online. So, and then there's even yet another layer. So some of them are also available for purchase, right? So you can buy, for instance, the Oklahoma WPA slave narratives. The authors are Baker and Baker, and those are the narratives that have been collected by people who were interviewed in Oklahoma. Texas has probably multiple volumes, if I'm remembering correctly. Arkansas, Georgia, Alabama. So all over the South, they have them, but northern locations, not so much. And this is terrible. I'm thinking not all of the border states either. But they're available online, but you can also, if you have access to a university library, see them. And I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying, because I'm a 19th century historian, I really like seeing the holding the books, because then you can flip through them. If you look at them at the Library of Congress's website, it doesn't have the same, you don't have the same ability to flip through and just accidentally fall upon information that you weren't expecting. The physical books also have indexes, and so you can look up material about particular subjects as well. So for instance, foodways or religious practice or that kind of thing, you can look that up in the index in the physical books.
All right, thank you. Here's another one. Did other tribes in Indian Territory practice slavery? I had always heard that Native Americans and African Americans often lived together peacefully.
Yes, there were other. So I'm gonna even back up a little bit. So yes, there are other groups that are practicing the enslavement of people of African descent, right? So the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Creek, the Seminole. Scholars talk about in terms of how enslaved people are treated as varying between the tribes. But I want to back up and say, so before the introduction of the enslavement of African people to these groups, Native tribes had already had a form of slavery in that they were enslaving other Native people through the process of warfare, right? So a great book to read on this topic is from Christina Snyder, spelled totally the normal way, S-N-Y-D-E-R. So the Native people had already been practicing enslavement, as if we look at cultures the world over have been practicing enslavement, right? So in particular, you're in battle, you capture people, and you tend to enslave women and children, not warriors. Warriors are often killed after a war, and then oftentimes the slaves will later be incorporated into your community, might be adopted in, and it's different in that in the previous practice, it's not a condition that's inherited, right, passing from mother to child or father to child. Obviously, they're not engaged in large plantation agriculture. So it looks different. And then it shifts as they're encountering colonists and then Americans. It shifts into the practice that looks more familiar to us, to Americans as they think about American history. And so then it's enslavement that is inherited. It's enslavement that's focused on people of African descent. It's more use of these enslaved people in agricultural work, right? So yes, I mean, that long answer is to say yes, that there were other groups in Indian Territory and in the Southeast before they get to Indian Territory who held people of African descent in bondage. So yes, that's existed. And I just want to address the other part of this question about the perception of cooperation or community or more peaceful coexistence between those groups. Some of that perception comes from the words of formerly enslaved people themselves. So there are some narratives where people, or slave autobiography, where they say that if they were going to be enslaved, they'd rather be enslaved by Native people, that Native masters are kinder, or that talk about running away to Native people, that if you're enslaved, you should run away to Native people because they're going to help you and treat you better. So there is that perception there, but there's also the reality that there were Native groups who enslaved people of African descent.
Thank you for that great answer. Okay, are the descendants of these freed people considered to be tribal members today?
It varies. So there was a huge controversy with the Cherokee Nation about whether or not to include the descendants of freed people. And actually there's been a recent decision in Cherokee Nation where some rights have been granted back. So it varies from group by the Native group, whether they're, so I should even back that up a little bit. So when the tribes are determining how they're going to include people as members or not include people as members, right? They're making their own determinations about this. They're often looking at these roles, these DAWS roles, D-A-W-E-S roles. And people there are listed as by blood or as freed people. And so then it's up to the tribes how they're going to decide what rights they're according these populations. And so there has been controversy about whether the freed people are going to be included with full citizenship rights, full voting rights, full rights to hold political office, full access to any federal services, etc. Right? So it varies from group based on what the community is deciding to do.
Okay. Do you know about how many people the Choctaw held in bondage around the time of the Civil War?
Let me go back to my numbers. And I will, okay, so in 1860, it's 2,349 out of a total population of 16,778.
So more than 10%.
14%.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Last question here. African Americans could homestead, so could these Choctaw freedmen homestead?
So I think technically they would have been able to homestead. But here's so I was looking at some numbers about what homesteading looks like. And here are some numbers from actually National Park Service, right? That there were 1.6 million families that received land grants due to the Homestead Act. And the number for Blacks is between 4,000 and 5.5 thousand, again, compared to 1.6 million. So it's about 0.3% of the, something in that order, right? So it's a very tiny portion. So I think there are multiple things happening, because some of these freed people would have been considered not US citizens in this moment. And then once, then as Oklahoma becomes a state, then they would have been citizens and could have accessed things in the same way that other US citizens could. But I think a different question might be, if you're going to get land from the tribal nation where you were owned, why pursue homesteading through the Homestead Act, right? Because this land, you don't have to have your patent, you don't have to prove it up, you don't have to do, have the 5-year period, you don't have to do any of those things in order to claim your ownership of that land. Why wouldn't you just stay in Choctaw Nation or Cherokee Nation and have access to land that way, right? I think you might be concerned that you're giving something up if you leave and become part of the United States and access land through the Homestead Act, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Garber, for such a fantastic and fascinating program. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us on a Sunday afternoon.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.